When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. But how did something as mundane as a traffic stop evolve into a moment that would forever alter the lives of both men? The answer lay in the tension between them, in the subtle power shifts, and in the startling revelation that no one saw coming. The sun was starting its descent over the streets of Sacramento, casting a warm glow that bathed the city in shades of gold and amber. It was a picturesque evening, one of those rare moments when the harshness of the day seemed to fade, replaced by a peaceful calm. Eric Porter, a professional man in his prime, was on his way home after a grueling day at the office. His sedan hummed softly, the gentle sound blending with the low hum of the city. He adjusted the air conditioning, welcoming the cool breeze that filled the car. He was eager to shake off the day's stress, to unwind, to forget about the meetings and deadlines. The radio played faintly in the background, a calming antidote to the noise of the busy streets outside. As Eric neared a yellow traffic light, he instinctively slowed down, waiting for it to turn red. But it was in that very moment that everything changed. Suddenly, the sharp blare of a police siren pierced the air, and blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. Why now? What had he done wrong? He glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, noticing the police cruiser pulling in behind him. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he guided his car to the side of the road. License and registration came the curt command from the officer who stepped out of the cruiser. Officer Bradley Larson, in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming proudly on his chest, was already striding towards the car with a purposeful gait. His swagger was undeniable, the confidence of someone used to being in control, accustomed to the authority his uniform provided. Eric reached into his glove compartment without hesitation, retrieving his registration and driver's license. His movements were deliberate, calm, almost too calm. But inside, his mind raced. What had he done wrong? He felt the officer's eyes burning into him, as if scrutinizing every movement, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, his voice flat but sharp with authority. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied, his voice steady and controlled. He maintained his composure, though a nervous tension coiled inside him. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, his tone still authoritative, though there was a flicker of hesitation. Eric frowned but nodded slightly, his mind processing the situation. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered by the window, his gaze narrowing as he studied Eric more closely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was something else, something Larson couldn't quite put his finger on. The air between them thickened, and Eric could feel the shift in the officer's demeanor. The calm, polite man sitting in the car no longer seemed like just another driver to Larson. Eric's composure, his lack of fear, his steady responses, all of it seemed to raise suspicions in the officer's mind. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked, the edge in his voice impossible to ignore. Eric hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions started to take on a darker tone, becoming less about the traffic violation and more about something else. Something that made Eric feel uneasy. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson leaned in closer, his eyes now scanning Eric more intensely. "Just going home?" Eric replied. His voice was still even, but there was a subtle change in the air, something that Larson clearly noticed. The officer no longer saw Eric as just a driver. He saw something else, something suspicious. Eric felt the shift in power, the tension building, but he refused to flinch. He was calm. He was in control. Little did Larson know that calm exterior wasn't naivety. It was pure control, and Eric had mastered it. This was just the beginning. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents with exaggerated slowness, a small gesture that seemed to signify he was in control of the situation. He tucked the documents into his chest pocket and straightened up, his expression now faintly smug, as though he had already decided what kind of man Eric was. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered suddenly, his voice commanding. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened for just a moment, but his face remained unchanged. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured and calm. Larson's lips twitched slightly, but he quickly masked it. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and palpable. Eric exhaled slowly, the tension within him building as he opened the door and stepped out. As he stood beside the car, Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood slightly taller than Larson, his broad shoulders giving him an imposing figure, but his demeanor was anything but threatening. He was a professional, a man of precision. His tailored suit, his polished shoes, they all suggested someone who took care in his appearance, someone who was meticulous and careful, but none of that seemed to matter to Larson. "Hands where I can see them," Larson barked, his command sharp. Eric complied without hesitation, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Larson smirked faintly, his expression shifting to one of barely concealed arrogance. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. The question landed with a force that Larson wasn't prepared for. For a moment, Larson's composure faltered, his eyes flashing with irritation. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt, more out of reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice thick with barely contained frustration. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied, his tone unwavering, firm. There was no defiance in his voice, but there was an unmistakable firmness that unsettled Larson. Larson leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Eric. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Eric let the silence stretch for a beat before responding, "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know?" Larson scoffed, but didn't reply. He stepped back and began pacing in a small circle, clearly agitated. The dynamic was shifting in ways he didn't quite understand. Eric wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, Eric was calm, collected, and his poise was beginning to unnerve the officer. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered almost to himself, "like you think you know what's going to happen next." Eric didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For a moment, Larson froze, the words hanging in the air. He turned to face Eric, and the smirk he had worn earlier was gone. In its place was something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come. Eric's calm demeanor had thrown him off balance, and Larson didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension between them became more palpable, more electric. Larson started to realize that this wasn't going to play out the way he had expected. Instead of backing down, Larson doubled down. His fingers tapped against the holster on his belt, a sign of his barely concealed frustration. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Eric. His gaze flicked back to the sedan as though searching for some justification for his suspicion. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice tight with frustration. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with incredulity as he responded. "Weapons? Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Eric saw the officer's composure crack. "I'm not going to ask you again," Larson snapped. Eric hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. But then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Larson approached, his boots crunching against the asphalt as he conducted the search. His hands were rough and quick, lingering a little longer than necessary in an attempt to assert dominance. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't stiffen. He didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back reluctantly. The admission seemed grudging, as if he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression still calm but his eyes sharp as ever. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Larson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to stay in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms. His posture relaxed, despite the building tension. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said, his voice steady. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That's so? You a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly, his tone playful but still sharp. "Or something." The ambiguity in Eric's answer seemed to irritate Larson even more. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met Larson's gaze evenly, unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson couldn't resist. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about?" "People like you always." He stopped abruptly, the words hanging in the air like smoke, unspoken but understood. Eric's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. "People like me?" Eric repeated softly, his voice charged with meaning. Larson bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean?" he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had just moments before. "I think I do," Eric replied quietly, his voice sharper now. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, Larson was on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it was going to be one that neither of them would ever forget. Eric's voice broke the silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows furrowed, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the crack in his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, heavy with something unsaid. Larson's eyes followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," Eric said casually, his tone now one of authority. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze, his eyes darting between the badge and Eric's face, searching for any sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority, only the weight of the truth. Eric took a step forward, closing the gap that Larson had instinctively created between them. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" Eric asked, his voice calm but sharp, cutting through the tension. It was a simple question, but one that sent a ripple through the air. Larson didn't answer right away. His eyes darted around, searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. The silence hung heavily between them, It's not the profiling, Eric continued, the weight of his words pressing down, though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. His words struck hard. Eric paused, watching Larson's face tighten with confusion. You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why? He didn't need to ask. He already knew the answer. It was written all over Larson's face. Larson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a brief moment, he was speechless. Eric's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. Every word that Eric spoke was like a hammer, hitting the nail squarely on the head. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. Eric finished the thought for him. His voice wasn't angry, but it was filled with the kind of quiet strength that made every word resonate deeper than any shout ever could. His words landed not just in Larson's ears, but deep within him. And that's not just a problem for me, Officer, Eric continued, his tone unwavering. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. It was a moment that no one would forget. Larson's whole demeanor shifted. The arrogance in his posture, the cocky confidence, it all crumbled away like sand slipping through his fingers. The weight of Eric's words sank in, and for the first time, Larson felt what it was like to be on the other side of the badge. Larson's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the very weight of Eric's accusations had crushed him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, his eyes flicking nervously, as if, just for a second, he thought the badge might somehow disappear if he didn't look at it too closely. But Eric wasn't going to let him off that easy. Eric stepped back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice still had an edge to it. Here's what's going to happen, he said, each word measured. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. The air around them seemed to thicken as the words hung in the air. Larson's lips parted, his breath caught in his throat, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. But the hesitation, it cost him, and Eric, sensing his weakness, pushed forward. His voice lowered slightly but held an undeniable power. You're going to hear from me again, Eric said, not as the driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge. The words landed like a bomb. Larson's face turned an unhealthy shade of red as the weight of the moment began to sink in. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his chest pocket, pulling out Eric's license and registration. It was as though every movement was now measured, as if he feared doing anything wrong would cost him everything. He handed over the documents without looking Eric in the eye. Eric took them without a word, calmly tucking them into his wallet. He moved toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing for a moment with one hand on the handle. He turned his head slowly and met Larson's gaze for one last time. This was it. This was the moment that would define both of their futures. Remember this, Officer Larson, Eric said, his voice steady, but filled with meaning. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. Eric slid back into his car and started the engine. As he pulled away, Larson stood in the fading light, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. The officer watched him go, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him, something irreversible. Eric's calm was unlike anything he had ever encountered, and it had stripped him of his arrogance. But for Eric, this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The next move would come, and it would ripple through the entire department like a stone dropped into a pond. His quiet determination was unstoppable. The drive home was a silent one, but Eric's mind was far from quiet. The encounter played over and over in his head, not because it was unique, it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time would be different. He had the power now. He had the authority to act, to change things, to hold people accountable for their actions. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk in the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The early sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. A file sat open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. Eric flipped through the pages, reading over the officer's record. It wasn't pretty. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings, things that had never been addressed properly. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his mind working through the broader implications. Larson wasn't an anomaly, he realized. Larson was a symptom of a deeper issue. An issue that wasn't just going to disappear if they swept it under the rug. He wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. No, this was bigger than one officer. This was about the system, about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. And Eric knew that if he was going to make a real difference, it had to start with him. It had to start now. A knock on the door broke his train of thought. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, handing over the documents. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded as he took the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course," she replied, slipping out of the room. Eric turned back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't solely on the officer. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a broken system, a culture that needed to change from the top down. Eric knew that if this was going to work, it had to start at the highest levels. It had to start with those in power who could truly make a difference. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense attitude, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady, yet filled with an unwavering resolve. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted, his voice tinged with weariness. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied, his words firm. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud. It's time for us to face it head on." Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this," he warned. "Good," Eric responded simply, his gaze unwavering. "It's about time someone did." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. It wasn't easy, but Eric was relentless. His mission was clear. He wasn't going to let this die down. Not this time. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings, watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. It was an uncomfortable experience for Larson, one that left him exposed. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson, it was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. His voice resonated with authority as he spoke, not of blame but of responsibility. It was a call for change, for unity, for a system that worked for everyone. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building here together. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of something better. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he glanced around the room at the faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he also knew that they had started something important, something that mattered. The journey was just beginning. And for Eric, that was enough for now. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real change, the ones that remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right. The events described in these paragraphs speak to a deep and undeniable truth about society, one that's hard to ignore and even harder to confront. It's about the abuse of power, the assumptions we make about others based on superficial judgments, and the systems that allow these injustices to continue unchecked. Eric's ability to stand firm in the face of authority is inspiring, but it also highlights something deeply troubling. The fact that so many people, particularly those in power, hold others to different standards based on their appearance, their background, or their perceived social status. We need to recognize that no one should ever be treated as less than because they don't fit someone else's idea of what's respectable or deserving of respect. This is a critical conversation that needs to be had, not just on the streets or in the courtroom, but in our everyday lives. When we allow discrimination, whether subtle or overt, to persist, we're perpetuating a culture of inequality. It's not just an issue for the victim in the situation, it's a societal issue that damages all of us. The silence and complacency we so often settle into only make things worse. When we turn a blind eye to injustice, we become complicit. This is why Eric's response wasn't just brave, it was necessary. He didn't just stand up for himself, he stood up for the truth, for accountability, and for the kind of world where people are treated with dignity and fairness. It's time for all of us to reflect on our own actions, to speak up when things aren't right, and to work towards a world where respect isn't a privilege, it's a right.